So welcome to the panel on societal considerations and impacts. And thank you to Jen Wilcox and the wonderful team that organized this great event. I am Hélène Pilorget, Research Associate working with Jennifer Wilcox here at Penn, and I am the moderator for this panel. I am going to take a few minutes to introduce the topic and myself, and then each member of the panel will take a few minutes to present their work, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. So most of my work focuses on spatial analysis and carbon accounting, looking mostly at the deployment of carbon capture, removal, and storage, and to drive two full carbon management pathways. The spatial distribution of resources and the mismatch that can happen between carbon capture locations and carbon storage possibilities has led me to look into biomass and CO2 transportation, about which I led a chapter on the Roads to Removal report. In addition to technical considerations, we need to consider that as we scale up CDR technologies, they are going to be impacting society. Given the potential scale-up to roughly 1 billion tons of removal by mid-century, it will be inevitable that CDR technology will interface with communities. But I think that I speak for everyone here when I say that we don't want CDR to be demonstrated and deployed in a similar fashion as we saw in the scale-up of the fossil energy production and use. Storing CO2 deep underground requires a lot of the same geophysics and engineering expertise that exist within the energy companies today. And as we scale up CDR, we need to do better, and in some cases, even restore some of the legacy impacts that the energy industry has created. It is thus essential to have meaningful community engagement, to find CDR strategies that work for communities, and to get people involved in the decision-making process. Several CO2 pipeline projects have already been canceled in the Midwest due to public opposition, which shows that societal and environmental considerations are not secondary and that they can actually make or break a project. So the Roads to Removal report has an entire chapter to discuss energy equity and environmental justice impact that was led by Kim Meffold, who is in this room. And each specific section in each chapters are focused on the specific impacts of each CDR technology. The extent of the CDR portfolio can be a little bit overwhelming, especially for communities and other stakeholders that are just getting started with the topic. That is why on the Roads to Removal website, there is an interactive map that shows data at the county level. It includes the CO2 removal options, the Energy Equity and Environmental Justice Index created by the Roads to Removal team, and the Social Vulnerability Index score from the Center for Disease Control. These two indices provide insights regarding the likelihood of co-benefits from CDR deployment with minimum risk and the vulnerability of communities. Recognizing that we need both community input about CDR and public education on CDR, this had led me to participate in listening sessions with tribal communities and rural communities in Nevada. The goal is to understand people's priorities and needs and to gather feedback and opinions on DAC and renewable energy developments. But there are people here on this panel who have much more experience than me in community engagement, thinking about what meaningful engagement looks like, how to communicate information to communities, what is the role of governments, NGOs, or academia in supporting communities, and how to draft policies that center people in the decision-making process. So first, we're going to go to Simone Stewart, who is a senior industrial policy specialist on climate and energy policy at the National Wildlife Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Simone Houston Stewart, and I work at the National Wildlife Federation. It's not glaringly obvious to people why someone from the National Wildlife Federation would participate in these conversations. Oftentimes, when I introduce myself that way, there's like a moment of people holding their breath in the room of like, is this person here to shut down everything that we're doing? So I just want to assuage maybe some of the fears in the audience. That I'm housed within our climate and energy team. So I do industrial policy on our team, which is overlooking all of our carbon management and some of our hydrogen portfolio. A little bit about me, I have a background in physics where I started undergrad fluids research related to enhanced oil recovery. And then in graduate school, I got my PhD in mechanical engineering where I studied the fluid mechanics of DAC. So I took a very like windy road to get to the National Wildlife Federation. But it really is an example of how one, I think an organization can come a long way in really reevaluating its mission and positionality in an important conversation. So the National Wildlife Federation is made up of 52 different affiliates or chapters across the US, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And so historically, when we think conservation, oftentimes we ask people this question and people say Teddy Roosevelt is who they think of when they think of conservation. And so it was around that time that they decided, we want to unite conservationists doing good work across the country. And so the National Wildlife Federation was created. We're, 75 something years old. Climate has only recently become a part of that mission in about the last 10 years or so of the organization, because there was this recognition that you can't do good conservation work without considering climate. And so in the climate sphere that we've developed sits industrial policy. So that's a little bit about the organization and how I fit in, and how we fit into this conversation, I would say, is partially because we have a constituency that we answer to, those 52 chapters in our affiliates. And so a lot of these people range on the spectrum across the US and our territories, to people who care very deeply about climate, to I think we did a poll around kind of like the average NWF person who donates, and it's like, a 60-year-old woman named Maud in the Midwest who likes butterflies and has a garden of native flowers. So, we're reaching a variety of people, many of whom are very new to this conversation. And so we felt like that was a way to position ourselves in this space, to leverage the strengths that we have. So our organization is founded on 3 pillars: the climate pillar, the conservation pillar, and more recently, environmental justice was included in this. One of the reasons that I really like to work at the National Wildlife Federation is that no matter what pillar you are housed in, you should be doing your work through the lens of the other 2 pillars. So I'm housed within the climate and energy pillar, but I'm always doing my work as an industrial policy specialist through the lens of conservation, the communities that fit under that umbrella, and through the lens of environmental justice and the communities that fit under that umbrella. I think it was earlier this morning when we were going over the report, someone said that, the conservation and the people who care about trees are a bit of like the OG in the carbon removal space. And I think that that is usually the level setting that we use with the public when we talk about why NWF is in a space like this, that you can care about all the things you care about, whether it's butterflies or native flowers or pronghorn antelope if you're in Wyoming, and what climate has to do with that and what industrial policy has to do with that. So I'm really proud of working at the National Wildlife Federation, even though it is not clear why a mechanical engineer would maybe work at the National Wildlife Federation. But I appreciate the unique lens that we're able to bring from bringing people of all perspectives into the conversation. So excited to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Vilas Anavarapu, Environmental Justice Fellow at the Great Plains Institute.
Hey, everybody. It's so lovely to be here. Also, had a wonderful lunch. I was talking to my parents about when they first moved to the US, and it was impossible to find vegetarian food options, let alone vegan. So it's lovely that we get to both be inclusive and also do good things for the climate. So my name's Vilas Anavarapu. It's Vilas like Velociraptor, if you need help remembering it. And I'm the inaugural Environmental Justice Fellow for the Great Plains Institute. I'm actually trained as an educator, and I taught middle schoolers, 6th graders in Title I schools in Jackson, Mississippi, which is where I live. So I have a lot of experience working with young people, their families, and their experiences, and a desire to create a more just, equitable world is what drew me to GPI. I'm part of a 15-month fellowship that focuses on the intersection between carbon management technologies and environmental justice. And just to plug the fellowship briefly, the first 3 months were I was getting paid to read a bunch of books and read reports and learn what carbon management was. And as someone who didn't come into this field with a technical background, that was such a great introductory point. And as you all continue to do the amazing work that you're doing, I'd encourage you to consider that. What are the ways you can bring in people who care about climate, who care about justice, who are in other fields that want to do this type of work? Now, after those 3 months were over, they're like, all right, you got to do work now. So I've been in the process of conducting an action project where I live in Mississippi. I'm working with 20 to 30 community-based organizations to craft a just transition plan for the state. It's involved a lot of conversations with people, understanding what their environmental priorities are and what sort of considerations are necessary to move Mississippi to meeting climate goals that are really important for our future. As a part of that, I'm really interested in communicating honestly and openly about where carbon management fits into that. Because honestly, I think it's a little unclear when we think about the big swings that we need to take to make that transition. I think people, for the most part, are like, yeah, we need solar, we need wind, but what is this 6% of emissions reductions that needs to happen through carbon management? And then what is an amine solution? It's complicated, it's confusing, it's difficult to understand. So I want to hit on 3 principles. The first one being education, the second one being community, and the third one being ownership. In terms of education, people are just at really vastly different places when it comes to their education and knowledge about the environment. I talk to folks who can give me really detailed estimates about how much the federal government is going to spend on 45Q, and other people who are worried that the size of a wind turbine is going to pollute their groundwater. People are not coming at this from the same perspective. And when we're communicating with communities, it's important to recognize that a single webinar, a single info session, it's not achieving the work that's really important, which is to give people a really holistic and detailed understanding of what some of our challenges are and how our technologies can be used to adequately address them. The other thing I want to say is when we talk about communities, I think we're very specific and hyperlocal, and we're like, this is how this plant will impact you and your neighbors in this way. And that's good, that's important, that's what people care about. But I do think we need to do more work into pulling people into this bigger analysis. What is this work that we are all trying to do as a collective people to solve climate change? What is your community specifically responsible for? And how can you participate in the global swings that we need to take? And I think we need to think of communities as co-conspirators, as partners, as doing this work with us, rather than just enabling us to do a specific discrete thing where they are. Next thing I want to talk about is community. We throw the word community around a lot, but I think it's a little unclear what it means. There's grass tops organizations with people who are being paid to do work, who are organizers every single day, 9 to 5. They're emailing, they're connecting with people. There's that level. There's also the families of the students that I work with who are working 3 jobs just trying to make it. They don't have time to go to a ton of community meetings. They don't even care necessarily about a specific project that's happening, but their voices matter too, and they need to be pulled in and supported so they can participate because they're just as much of a part of the community as everyone else is. So when we're talking about reaching out to community, I think we need to be introspective about what is community to begin with, and how can we do the work of building community? Within communities, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and people in community disagree all the time. People are misinformed, people are informed. It's not as easy as saying, like, let me identify what the community is and then connect. It's a lot harder, a lot more complicated, and I'm interested in seeing our work be reaching out to community and building those communities as well. The last thing I want to hit on is ownership. I think the biggest way to get buy-in for any sort of project is making people owners of the project, whether it's worker ownership or community ownership or collaborative decision-making structures. The more benefits and decision-making power flows to communities, the more compelling any sort of project is. So thank you so much. So happy to be here and excited for the conversation.
Thank you. Now we have Kyle Clark-Seddon, Principal of Climate Aligned Industries at the Rocky Mountain Institute.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm a principal in the Carbon Dioxide Removal Initiative at RMI, where I lead our policy and markets work. RMI is a global nonprofit focused on supporting the clean transition of our energy system as well as industry. And we operate in all major sectors of the economy as well as in most geographies around the world. In addition to CDR policy and markets, the CDR initiative works on RD&D as well as deployment of CDR technologies. You may have seen some of our work on technology road mapping in the Applied Innovation Roadmap, or our recent paper on electrochemical approaches to DAC. On deployment, we support projects in a number of different ways, whether it's through our startup accelerator, Third Derivative, or RMI is also taking a leadership role in the Anchoron Direct Air Capture Hub, which later this year will be kicking off a feasibility study in the Pacific Northwest with funding from the Department of Energy. Thank you for that. And also a bunch of amazing technical partners and donor support as well. One of my main focuses right now is helping to support the development of policy for CDR at the state level. And later this year, we're going to be releasing something called the State CDR Atlas, which will be a data tool that helps policymakers and other stakeholders at the state level better understand the opportunity of CDR at the state level and then connect that back to the policy and regulatory frameworks that are needed to unlock that. And so I wanted to flag that because the Roadster Removal Report was and is an important resource for us. So thank you to that team for all that work. When I look across RMI's full portfolio of work in the context of this particular topic, there's a lot of really important linkages, I think. In our work on RD&D this year, we're looking really hard at integrating CDR into existing industries. And we're finding, in particular, a lot of opportunities to leverage existing waste streams or waste stockpiles in some cases, and doing CDR with those in such a way that in some cases we can remediate those wastes and reduce harms to the environment and to the community. In our work supporting, excuse me, in our work to support deployment, we were really eager to take on this leadership role with the Anchoron Direct Air Capture Hub because we wanted that opportunity to develop a hub that centers community engagement and community benefits from the very beginning. And we're really keen to explore alternative ownership models or alternative governance structures that ensure that communities and impacted stakeholders have real influence over decision-making and planning from the very beginning through to the retirement of a facility. And lastly, on our policy and markets work, we're interested in developing the policy frameworks that can help CDR scale rapidly, but in a safe and supported way. RMI really believes that a well-directed market is the fastest way to bring about change in the world. But well-directed is a really important term there. We need guardrails to ensure that as we develop this market, it's done so in a safe way that incorporates consideration of communities from the beginning and ensures that we are building for the long term. Lastly, I'll just say, we need to grow this industry really quickly, but we also need it to stand the test of time. And early mistakes can put cracks in that foundation. And so while we are thinking about moving fast, we also need to be thinking like an endurance athlete and not sprinting so fast at the beginning that we don't get to the finish line. So it's all about starting right so that we can finish strong. And yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And then we have Margot Quorum, Division Director for Engagement at DOE FECM.
Thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation. So as you notice that my title underneath my name actually hides the Council on Environmental Quality. So I am actually on assignment from DOE over there. But today I'm going to really just focus on some of the work I have been doing with my team in FECM as Division Director for Engagement and Carbon Management. So one of the things, and you all have actually touched on a lot of stuff that I wanted to say, so just a little bit of background about me. I started with DOE in January of this year. I've kind of had the full cycle of 20 plus years at USGS. I have come from the dark side, worked on the original sedimentary basin assessment for CO2 storage back in the day. Now I've returned back home. And if you would ask me a million years ago if I'd be in this spot right now, in this place, I'd probably tell you no. But it's extremely important work that we're all doing here for a variety of reasons. And so within my division, and there is a domestic and an international side. I'm not really going to belabor the international because I think it's really important here to hit on the topics of what we're doing domestically. And so really the key items that we're focused on here is working with stakeholders, collaboration, having those early conversations. So we've hosted a couple different workshops in different areas. We had one in Houston last year. There will be 3 other workshops in Houston that Climate Now is also going to be working next month. We had one in Pueblo. But really the important part there is, and what most don't really understand, is that there's a lot of upfront work that goes into this in the sense of understanding who's your audience, who's the community. In addition to is making sure that all stakeholders have that opportunity to have the conversations with you to really just listen. It's not a point of when you're starting the initial conversations to really get into not listening or kind of getting in the realm. You really want to hear what are their challenges on the landscape? What are they dealing with? Who makes up the community? Who are the advocates? Who are the naysayers? Like, where are all these different challenges? And so having those conversations early is extremely important to move the dial there. So we try to do that early as possible when we know we're going in and have multiple meetings. In addition to, we'll have webinars, right? And that's also just to kind of lay the foundation of understanding what we're trying to do, which is really coming in and educating on the technologies, which my group is solely focused on, for the most part, on the domestic, is the carbon safe projects, which was bill funded. But really understanding, what's going on in the needs, what tools, where are they at of understanding what exactly carbon management is, and then where to fill those gaps. If it's from videos, FAQs, whatever it can be, but provide those tools. But in addition to, we also have just developed tools for industry to set standards. So the Responsible Carbon Management Initiative, the principles were just released last month. More information will come on how that's going to look in the final stages of that. But again, it's to have industry accountable and, and have a gold star that they can actually point to, that what they're following and moving things forward, because that's also beneficial as well. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is just, as I kind of touched on those, it's just place-based community engagement. My group can't be everywhere across the United States, and we are targeting certain areas. But again, it's just very important. So for the outside Houston workshops that are coming up next month, every workshop's different. So this one actually has a planning committee, right, from all different walks to help kind of, put the agenda together, look at what needs to be done, and address the concerns of the community. Because if you don't have the support of the communities in that sense, as you mentioned earlier, that can be challenges across the board of how successful these projects actually are. And so it's behoove of us to make sure that we're sharing and disseminating as much knowledge as possible, and even just talking amongst ourselves to understand what tools we have available versus what you may have available. Because it's not necessarily easy to find some of this information, and sometimes the federal government is not necessarily looked as a trusted source. So we also rely on others to be our collaborators and our partners in helping get this message across. But I think that's really what I just really wanted to touch on, just some of the things that we're doing. But again, this is extremely imperative and important to really move the dial on this. And kind of as Kyle just mentioned, we're kind of in between a sprint and a marathon and making sure that we are doing this correctly. We learn from our mistakes. We're getting information out that is correct, and then just listening. I find that to be, if you would ask me 20 years ago about this, I'd been a different story. But just really hearing where people are concerned, if it's jobs or just misinformation, listening, just openly listening, non-judgment, and then trying to tease out what the real issue is. Is it just that they're wrong sources, or they don't know enough, or they've listened to something or pulled something off social media, whatever it may be. But the point of the matter is just to, listen openly and then try to tease out so we can just do better at education. So.
Well, thank you to all of you for sharing your experience. Now I have a few directed questions, and then we're gonna get the Q&A from the audience. So my first question actually goes to Margot. What are the government's efforts towards environmental justice policies, and also how to create timeless and binding policies related to CDR?
That's a good question. So as you know, the administration has a lot of different policies out there. We have the EJ40, right, which is looking at 40% of funding that's being assigned is actually going to underrepresented communities. That's one of the things. These are in place. The other thing is the Executive Order 14008, which is tackling climate here and abroad. That set a lot of the foundation. That one actually is kind of interesting because it also set up the WEJAC, which is the White House Environmental Justice Council Advisory Committee. And so, which we all are responsive from a CEQ perspective, from an agency perspective of trying to respond to the recommendations that they had published last year on carbon management. The other thing I just want to touch on is the climate and economic justice screening tool. Again, these are just things that have already been in place. I'm going down my list because I know I'm going to forget something. But I think it's, these are this foundation. And I really believe that the work that the agencies have put forward, especially with the 5 recommendations that the WEJAC had provided, not that we can touch and fix all of them, but we have implemented as a federal whole different products that will help kind of address the issue. So DOE had led with other agencies developing a carbon resource tool. So you can go on, it's FAQs, videos, there's actual even publications there. That's just one example. Another example is that there is an interactive map that you can see where all different projects are and kind of drill down. So again, this just feeds into showing where the gaps are, but then also more tools and information that are out there. But I think what I really want to touch on is for the CDR policies. So there's a couple different things that are in work, again, at the agency level. So you actually have old policies, Energy Act 2020 bill, as I had touched on, but we have 45Q, right? That's another policy that's in place that is an iteration. There are the offshore, BOEM has an offshore CCUS guidance that's rulemaking that's in the process, right? USDA has some other items for the national parks, that's national forest, that's also looking at CCUS policy. So these are all in early development. They've been posted, comments have been received, not for BOEM, that's in the news, that process as well. But this is just the starting and the foundation for moving things forward. But what I really want to touch on here is just another item that I think is extremely important. It just came out, is that NIST has an announcement out right now for CDR. Some of you may or might not know this. I'm hoping you all do. But it's basically they're looking for memberships for a consortium. And it's really to look at and develop and to measure and develop standards around CDR. And I think that is extremely important to move things forward and what you can identify and how to move things forward with policy. So that's what I'd like to add. Thank you.
Thank you. My second question goes to Kyle. What are questions that you often hear from people when you do community engagement? And what are some co-benefits that community are showing interest towards or could be of interest to communities?
Yeah, so I'll be transparent and say that RMI has not yet started to do in community engagement, but I've in listening and learning and getting ready as a team to do that, we've learned a few things, and then I would also turn to my co-panelists who have more experience on this. I mean, I think that in the last session, one of the things that came up was that sometimes you have community members that are not really all that concerned about the project itself. They're more interested in what are the sort of day-to-day impacts that are just irritating for all of us. Like, how many trucks are going to pass by my house? And what's the change in traffic going to be like? What's the noise level going to be like? Will my kids be able to nap, while this thing's being built down the road for me. And so I think that, in some cases when we think about community engagement, we feel like, okay, we need everybody to have a master's in environmental science after this session and understand like how, we drill this well, or how we, apply this rock to this farmland. And there will be audiences or some community members that want to know those things, but we need to be open to, in some ways, the more mundane questions that people might want to know about the project. And so I think ultimately it comes down to, assessing your audience and listening to what they actually care about, rather than, prematurely making assumptions about what they want to know about and what their main pain points are, so that when you go into these engagement opportunities, you're not so inflexible that you're not meeting community members where they are in terms of what the kind of engagement, the kind of agency they want to have in the process. And so, yeah, but I would love to hear actually what my co-panelists think about that.
I'm going to share a bit of a hot take. So I think it's really hard to communicate about CDR or any sort of carbon management technology by just talking about the technology. I think you have to talk about the entire scope of the crisis. I think you need to talk about like what is happening with climate change, what are all the different things that we need to do to get us to net zero, what specifically then can CDR or carbon capture do to get us to that point. So that, I think, is like the third or fourth conversation you have with community members for them to understand why a project like this is necessary. Because otherwise, the conversation you have is very different. It's why are we building these pipelines? Why is this really expensive infrastructure happening? In the case of something like carbon capture, why are we putting retrofits on fossil extraction processes that have already done so much damage in our communities, when every environmental justice principle is stop producing oil and gas? I don't think it makes intuitive sense to immediately start talking about carbon capture or CDR without first doing that big picture analysis of here are the pathways, here are the big things that we need to do to meet our goals. Here are some of the equity considerations we want to maintain, like affordable energy in the process of getting to these goals. Then let's talk about the nitty-gritty of what is the project that we're doing with CDR or carbon capture, what are some of the specific benefits that might come to a community, and then what are some of the technical processes for how that technology works.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what my colleagues have said up here. I guess one of the other things that I have to contribute to this conversation is that when I have had conversations with folks from all over the country that represent a variety of communities, and the skepticism I hear a lot is, I think, and maybe this is more of just kind of a thought rather than an answer, but I think that there are often these very big truth revealing moments that we have as a society. And I think, an example of that is like the COVID pandemic, right? I think that we will be studying for decades to come how that has impacted our lives in ways that we're not even aware of. But one of the ways that we have become aware of is the veil it peeled back on the healthcare system. It exposed inequities, it exposed failures, it exposed pain points. And I think that as a person who is in this space, has been in this space and studied it from a very academic perspective, and is now in a very kind of real world perspective, and cares very deeply about how this space is done, I think that carbon management has had a similar kind of veil peeling moment for the climate movement and climate justice, in a way that this investment and this timeline and movement has exposed for people the pain points, the inequities. And it's not to say necessarily that carbon management is responsible for any of those things. COVID didn't make the healthcare system inequitable, right? But it is that people care about these things, and in this revealing want answers and want solutions created out of this. And so I think that some of the best work that we can do is to think and innovate and dream in a really big way beyond just CDR, and what it can mean for people both domestically and globally to answer some of the questions that they have, from the mundane all the way to, one of the very big questions at the beginning: should the fossil industry have a role in any of this, right? That there are questions across a spectrum. And so I think in the listening and in having those conversations and educating people, like Vilas said, that we have some very big questions to answer that are philosophical as well as technical.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question more for Vilas and Simone, which is, what does community support actually means? And what are some examples of policy tools that are or could be providing meaningful support to communities?
Yeah, I'll start just a little bit. Money is one of them. NWF, because we have this affiliate structure, often gets approached by people that want us to help leverage it. So I don't know how many times I've been approached at events like these or larger ones by, a pipeline company being like, you really should come out and see our pipeline and maybe, give it a stamp while you're at it. Because what does that mean to have a National Wildlife Federation stamp? And, if it's in a particular state, well, you should have the Wyoming Wildlife Federation come out and, we'll have a whole party with them, sort of thing. But what I think that people don't realize is we pay our affiliates to engage with us. They are autonomous individual organizations. So when I call up the Louisiana Wildlife Federation to talk with them about blue hydrogen on Lake Maurepas, which is a really big issue there, if any of you have tuned into it, you should go to Louisiana. It's wonderful to talk to people about it there. When I dial that number, I know that they're going to answer because I've built rapport with them. I have a relationship with them, but also we're compensating them. And that's even within our internal structure. So these are people that are a part of what we like to call the Federation family. I'm a millennial, so I'm like, but the Federation family, the larger 52 chapters. And so I would say that compensation is incredibly important to allow people to do the education, to have the conversations, to engage on the work, and to create sustained relationships that's something that we talk about, things move at the speed of trust. And also I think that money and investment is a way to show that you are truthful about wanting to build this relationship. It's not just about like buying people off, but it's something that we hear about, especially at NGOs. We get asked all the time to do things and are not expected to be paid for it. And oftentimes it's, out of the goodness of your heart kind of thing. But it can be out of the goodness of my heart and for the goodness of my pocket, right? To engage in these conversations and build these relationships. So I will say that, that's a big part of what we do. We compensate our affiliates when we have conversations with them. And for us, it's really about self-determination at NWF. I don't live in Louisiana, I live in DC. So who am I to dictate to the people that live around Lake Maurepas that they should accept things, that come their way? We really try to strive as a resource and providing information, like Margot was saying, collaborating with these agencies and offices, collaborating with the technical experts to get the resources and communicate at a level that people can take away and understand to answer their questions. Sometimes it's being like on call and, somebody from Louisiana calls me and says, hey, I saw this. Can you explain this to me? And that's work, right? Being able to do that. So I think, not coming in with any kind of judgment, but also being there as a resource to allow people to gain information to make decisions for themselves. And I think people know the difference between you giving me information and telling me what you want me to do and giving me information and me having the complete authority to determine with my lived experience and my history what I'm going to do with that information.
Yeah, so well stated. Money is so important. Also, to build off of what you were saying about decision-making power, if we're doing community engagement work and the community is like, no, we hate this, and you're like, well, we did the work. We reached out to the community, and that no, it doesn't mean anything. You're not really doing cooperative work with communities, right? And I think that's really hard. A lot of work goes into these projects, a lot of money, time, effort. It's hard to hear a no at the end of the day. But if we're serious about actually building structures with community buy-in, hearing a no means like, all right, sorry, this project can't move forward. The other thing I'll add, I live in Mississippi, so there's a lot of tensions between state-level policymakers and places like Jackson, where I live. So I think on the flip side of that, developers, federal agencies, there's a ton of opportunity to do things that are progressive, that are really meaningful, that take the needs and interests of citizens who live in that place seriously, because the state certainly isn't doing it. So in the same way that you got to hear a no, there's other ways to build on opportunities that might not be there right now.
I think we should move to Q&A. Do you have questions in the room, or we can also take a question online?
We can start with an online question, and then there are some in the room here. So speaking of finances, is there any consideration to approach carbon removal in a similar way to biodiversity finance and ecosystem services finance? Specific examples could be, can green bonds to be expanded to include carbon removal? Is there a discussion of finance mechanisms like reinsurance of atmospheric quality, similar to reinsurance of ocean reefs? Are there other creative ways to cooperatively leverage private capital with public administration?
To answer that one.
Yes, I think, we even saw, I think last week there was a deal announced, and I'm blanking on the company and a lot of the details, but where insurance was a really important part of securing the financing for this offtake to go through, or this intent to offtake to go through. And so I think there's certainly a really important role for insurance to play. To try and tie it back to the societal considerations and community considerations, I think that being able to plug into these existing kind of institutional structures to build credibility for the field to the point where you can get the insurance industry off the sidelines and into the game speaks a lot to the credibility of the technology and the project and things like that, and can help to build trust with community members and support for it. I can't speak to green bonds. I think there's a lot of really creative financing ideas out there that we need to try, though.
Awesome. The question, Noah with Heirloom. I think every panelist mentioned education. I'm really curious as to what your perspective is as to how different organizations should play into the educational journey of society and individual communities as they come along on the ride with us for carbon removal. So between NGOs and governments and individual companies, kind of how do you view those different roles and different aspects of education?
Communities experience a ton of burnout with the level of engagement that can happen frequently. So it's like too many people are asking for their time and attention. When thinking about multiple actors being engaged in a space, I wonder if coming up with systems where those actors can coordinate first ahead of time and think about how they can set up a plan to reach out to communities so you can share information and not overburden folks would be a really thoughtful way to do it. Also, I think I've communicated my views on this is that anytime you educate community members, giving people the big picture is really crucial to understanding why any one specific intervention might be necessary. And it's great if you have a bunch of different organizations because they all come with different expertises. So also laying out a strategy where one person takes this topic and another person takes this topic, and there's some sense of continuity, I think could accomplish both education goals and make sure that communities' time isn't used up too quickly.
I'll add that I think part of it too is as an NGO, it's about knowing your strength and knowing your audience and who's listening to you. So frequently when I introduce myself, I say maybe some of you in the audience are familiar with Ranger Rick magazine. It is the magazine that NWF releases for young people, young kids, and there's Cub, which is like even littler. But there's a lot of really interesting things that happen in that because we're trying to get people to be conservation minded from a very young age. And so we know that we have a variety in terms of age audience, the little kids all the way up to, Maud, who loves her butterflies in the Midwest. But I think that we try to approach people from what they care about and what they're interested in. And so, some examples of this have been around, NWF had done like a lead-free ammunition campaign, which is like very niche, and I wasn't even aware until I joined the space. But hunters, a particular ammunition has lead in it. So sometimes when they go out and hunt, there will be remnants of the ammunition that are, scattered through the wildlife areas, and that will leach into groundwater. And so there was a big kind of push around around, well, this is pollution, thinking about how it impacts climate, thinking about how it impacts people's well-being. But rather than starting from that point, it was like to meet with hunters and anglers and to say, hey, let's talk about what practices you guys are using. Let's talk about the ammunition that you like to use. And so it was approaching people from what they cared about, which was hunting. They may say, I don't really care about the climate because it doesn't impact me. Maybe I don't believe in climate change, right? But reaching people with what is important to them and starting the basis of the conversation from there, because as we've seen today, there are so many aspects of society that carbon removal touches, that climate touches. It's so intersectional. So there's always a way to pull climate in and connect people to that. But I think that that also shows a willingness to engage on the level where they are, to bring them into the conversation, to say, I see that this is what you care about. I see this is what's important to you. And I want to engage on that and how this relates to something larger.
Can I add to that as well? I think it's also important that everyone's communicating of wherever you're going into. So if you know that there's been little or a lot of activity, that you're reaching out to your other stakeholders to bring them in so you can try to get around the fatigue that does happen. But just, I think just starting that out and understanding and assessing prior to going in, and kind of what Simone touched on, and then evaluating what the needs are for the community. But I think it's just really important just to have that early conversation so you know who's been in, who hasn't been in, who should be in the room when you're going in to engage.
I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, quick one. So we've talked a bit about impacts, but people write community benefit plans, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the benefits. Oftentimes like number of jobs is listed, but what are the actual benefits that we should be thinking about when we think about communities?
So NWF did some work earlier in the year in Louisiana, as I kind of stated, from a variety of different communities. And so when we did some focus groups and talked with varied communities across Baton Rouge and New Orleans, we asked people, what do you consider to be a benefit from a project that would be developed in your area? One of the things that we heard a lot about, and I think Vilas kind of touched on this, is, the difference between action at like a localized level and a state level. A lot of what we heard as far as benefits had to do with infrastructure. And so specifically in Louisiana, people said, well, if you're going to build a project in this particular area, it would be great if you could build a levee in that same area. That benefits us as a community when flooding happens. It would also benefit your project by the levee protecting the community. So there were lots of different aspects of, whether it was, if you're going to be driving trucks through this area all the time, repave the roads was a big deal. So I think there's lots of different ways to think about infrastructure in the built environment when we think about projects. One of the other things that NWF is also very supportive of that we were hearing was environmental monitoring. A lot of times people are able to say, oh, well, this isn't the way that it was 20 years ago, but we don't really understand what the baseline was 20 years ago. And so Lake Maurepas, for example, Southeastern University is doing a project where they were funded by Air Products, who was like the project holder, to do independent research on environmental monitoring of the lake. And so they have 4 buoys that are scattered throughout this very, very large lake that are taking real-time data, uploading it to a public website that anybody can access to see what the pH of the lake was that day, to get the CO2 content in the lake, to get all of these other things. And then that becomes university data that they're then working on publishing in journals. And so now for the first time, people will have an environmental baseline for what this lake looks like before a potential storage project could get approved in the lake. And so I think that that's some of the things that even just asking the community, they were saying, we don't know what this looks like. I know just because I'm a resident and I have an understanding, but it would be really great if we could get third parties, universities, or other third parties to come in and get really detailed data about what this looks like. And that data then benefits everyone. So environmental monitoring is one of the areas that we're very strongly supportive of. That was an area that we financed as NWF. We passed money along to Southeastern. So when you talk about money and financing, it all kind of comes back to that. But there were some really great environmental kind of questions that people had that could be answered for both the benefit of the project and the community.
If I could play with your question a little bit and imagine, right now we don't have a huge CO2 utilization market, right? But imagine if, in communities where we're sequestering a bunch of CO2, there are certain breakthroughs in what that market could look like. What if we're collaborating with communities so as businesses and enterprises develop from CO2 utilization, they're built so they're worker owned and community controlled, and you're doing economic development in a grassroots, local, just and transparent way.